Meni Caroutas, welcome into the weeds. Really appreciate you taking the time to come and talk to us about your story, your career, and the fascinating work you do.
Yeah, no, it's good to be. Thank you for the invitation.
Now, you are, people would know you from more recently your amazing podcast, The Missing, which people should check out. You're an author, you're a journalist, but you started out as just a boy down in Wollongong who wanted to be a cop.
Yeah, I always
Why a cop, mate? What drew you to be a policeman, ultimately a detective? What drew you to law enforcement as a young man?
Well, there were two things that I wanted. I was interested in journalism, and I was interested in being a cop. And when I finished school, I went to uni. I sort of didn't really know what I wanted to do, and I applied around some newspapers around New South Wales, try and get a cadetship. But it's fairly rare to, you probably need someone. And then, as I said, my very close second choice was police, and I applied for the police.
Why was that? What drew you? Like, what was it about flipping over rocks and investigating things that?
Yeah.
Were you a curious kid?
Huge curiosity. Always asked a lot of questions, and I guess I liked problem solving, so to speak. And I like to I guess get to the core of things. Find the truth in that. I grew up in a pretty close knit family, so I've always had a real sense of justice and doing the right thing. And was always taught by mum and dad that it's really good if you can help other people. If you can in a position to help other people, and the police just I think presented that, and also journalism. But also, when I was a young kid, I was 20 years old, so I needed to grow up. And I also thought that that discipline, being in an academy and, on the parade ground and all that stuff and having the study, I thought would have been good for me, and I would have grown up. And, so they're the reasons.
So you went through New South Wales, you went through Goulburn.
Yeah.
You turn out, you're a young, naive probationary constable. Where did you end up?
Well, when I was at the academy, I studied really hard. Like, people would go home weekends. We were there for 11 weeks. I was there every weekend studying. And we had a reunion a couple of years ago, and one of the guys in my class, Michael, recounted the story that on Friday they'd all be going out, into town to get on the drink, and they go past my town, they'd see the light on, they'd say, "Oh, there's Meni studying," So I worked really, really hard, and I came second in my class out of 100. And I wanted to be the best I could be. So when I was at the academy, I did some research, and Darlinghurst and the King's Cross Patrol came up as being, the place to be.
The hotspot.
Yeah, the hotspot.
Sin City.
Yeah. So I went and asked one of the sergeants there. I said, before we get allocated our station, can I please have go to Darlinghurst? And he looked at me like I was mad, and I got my wish, and I got Darlinghurst, and then
So this is what, like early 80s, mid 80s?
84.
84.
So I got out of the academy. We went in August, and I think it was the 22nd or something of October. We passed out of the academy. Yeah.
But by then, in 1984. King's Cross, well, it had always been Woolloomooloo, King's Cross, Darlinghurst. It had always been a pretty rough area, a lot of organised crime. But by 1984, it had been it was internationally recognised as a hotspot for vice and corruption. There was prostitution, illegal casinos, a lot of street life, a lot of gangsters around, and you wanted to get stuck straight into it.
I think I just wanted to learn. I was really keen, I worked hard at the academy and put my head down and all that. And I guess I just wanted to be the best, that I could be. And I guess maybe in the back of my mind, I thought that maybe some people didn't think I had the discipline to go through and do it. So I guess I probably wanted to prove to myself and some other people that I did have that discipline. And I've always been like that, whatever I do, whether it was sport or anything, I always wanted to do it at the highest level and the best I could. So policing was no different. I was very, very naive, but I was incredibly fortunate that back in those days, there were senior officers, and you worked for the first year or so with senior officers, and they were really good people I'm still in contact with. And, they look after you. And, I was lucky that they taught me the right things. I didn't work with anyone that was a bit shonky or anything. I was very fortunate.
And so tell us about that. You're a young man. You're turning up at Darlinghurst. Like, tell us about you're a constable. What did they do? Just send you out on a beat to patrol up and down Darlinghurst Road? Like, what was?
Well, we were in Darlinghurst initially. I started, so we had vehicles, but I didn't get off to the best start. A good friend of mine, Paul Fredericks, who recently retired after almost 40 years in the force. And he's 3 generations. His daughter's just joined. His dad was a very well-known detective. We were starting on a Monday, so we organised we'd meet out the front of the police station, an hour before we was meant to be there, and go in together. And you're supposed to go in and ask for the training induction officer. So we went in 15, 20 minutes early, and you'd walk into Darlinghurst police station and there was an inquiry counter on the right. And there was a gentleman there, big barrel-chested with a moustache, glasses just halfway down his nose, and he's typing on the typewriter. And, I said, excuse me, Senior Constable, you had 2 stripes. I said it a couple of times, just completely ignored me. And Paul and I looked at each other and, okay. So, at 3, 4, 5 minutes seemed like an eternity. And again, I said, excuse me, Senior Constable, my name's Probationary Constable Meni Caroutas, and before I could introduce Paul, he looked up at me and said, effing probationary constables, F off. Just screamed at us. So Paul and I looked at each other, shut ourselves, of course, and we walked out. And we're looking at each other like, what just happened? Anyway, and then we stayed out there, outside the police station for another half hour. And then a sergeant came by and he says, you guys starting today? And we said, yeah, we are, Sarge. And he was the training induction officer. He said, what are you doing standing out here? Anyway, so we followed him in, kept our heads low because we were afraid of this guy. And that was our first start. I'm glad to say that subsequently, this guy, we became friends. I guess it was like an initiation or whatever. And it was, I guess, the way you handled it. I didn't cry over it. I didn't complain. Didn't tell that sergeant. I tried to avoid this guy. Luckily, we were on different shifts. But probably a few weeks into it, I remember I was starting afternoon shift, and finishing morning shift, and I think he was starting afternoon shift. And I was in a muster room, and he came in, and his name was Bruce Shepherd, and I stood up and I saluted, and I said, Senior Constable Shepherd, sir. Just trying to have a bit of fun. And he said, I had these Caroutas. And I guess it showed I had a sense of humour, and I hadn't, got the shits with what happened. And I think I got his respect then, and we got on really well. Whereas others who may have whinged and, he swore at me and all this sort of stuff, he continued to give them a hard time.
So tell us about Darlinghurst, the Cross, that area, heading out into the culture of it's a very different place now. It's very gentrified. It's sort of most of the vice and corruption is certainly moved off the street, but out of that area and sort of into the suburbs. But that back then, 1984, it was like a hotbed. This is pre-Wood Royal Commission. There'd been a few Royal Commissions around, but Abe Saffron was still ruling the roost in King's Cross. Yeah. There was a lot of street prostitution. Tell us about patrolling and being a cop on the scene in that time.
Well, it was when I describe it, it was the Mardi Gras, the circus, New Year's Eve, all rolled into one.
And 24/7.
Yeah, 24/7. It never slept. And that was the thing. I mean, you'd be driving around. I mean, back in those days, both sides of William Street from, as soon as the sun went down, were lined with prostitutes. Darlinghurst Road as well was lined with prostitutes. And, everyone had their corner. Like there was an area just off adjacent to William Street called Premier Lane, and all the transvestites would be there. So it was a narrow lane. You'd drive the police truck up there, and there was always, a Mercedes, a Beamer, some rich person up there, trying to get their kicks from a tranny. There was the Maori prostitutes would work near the Boulevard Hotel. So everyone had their section, and then you had the girls up and down the street.
There was the Wall as well, which was notorious.
Yeah, the Wall. Yeah, there was the what they called the Wailing Wall, where there was normally male young prostitutes, and and there was some significant cars that had been seen there. The thing was, it really was just excitement overload all the time. But the real sort of bad thing about the 80s was that heroin was the drug sort of a choice, and it was so destructive. And it was nearly every day. I mean, you'd be called to an overdose. Someone had overdosed and died, and that was really, really sort of quite sad, and sort of made you think. But as a young kid, like I'd never seen or experienced death or anything. And a couple of weeks in, we attended a terrible old DOS house, and there was an old gentleman who had passed away, sitting in a chair at the back of it. He'd read the paper every morning. He had a heart attack and died. And I remember we went to his room, and it was just one little room, no bathroom, no nothing. And he was a big man, probably over 6 foot tall, and sleeping in a small child's bed, and had nothing. And we're sort of going through his drawers and that to see who he was, if there's any next of kin. And I remember I pulled out a tin. It was an old Cravenet filter cigarettes. We used to come in a tin. And I opened it, and there was all these little black and white photos. And it was this man when he was in the RAF in England. He was obviously in the Air Force. And he was there splendid in his uniform with another man and two ladies. And on the back of it was, I forget the gentleman's name, but it was signed, with love, Lucy. And we did what we had to do. No relatives or anything like that we could find. So, the government contractors take him, and, I guess he got a pauper's burial, paid for by the state. But I remember for days after, it really knocked me around because, I came from a really close-knit, loving family, and I thought everyone had that.
Yep.
And I guess I I couldn't reconcile the photo of that handsome, strong, hero, who'd fought for his country, and where he'd wound up, in this shitty little DOS house, all alone. And so things like that really made you grow up a lot, and you realise that the world wasn't perfect, that there's a lot of sort of bad stuff and a lot of lonely people. And that was really common. We had a lot of people like that.
Well, it was particularly hard if you're an empath, which I think you are. You have this empathy and this care for these people, but the culture there also was there were a lot of damaged people. A lot of the Cross was a place where a lot of people that had been damaged by society, by their backgrounds, went to try and survive, get together. It was essentially sort of an outdoors public, asylum, wasn't it? There were a lot of mental health issues, a lot of violence, a lot of alcohol. It must have been a bit hard to handle at times.
Yeah, look, it was, but I think I don't think it ever sort of got to me where it really worried me or anything. Because as I said earlier, I think I was really fortunate when I joined. I think for the police that worked Darlinghurst and King's Cross in the 80s, that era will never come again. No one will ever experience the stuff we experienced. And as I said, sure, there were bad apples. There's bad apples and everything. But the majority of the police I work with were really good people. And I'm always been fortunate that, felt fortunate that I work with these people because they sort of took you under their arm. We became friends. They taught me things. Even when, I couldn't understand something, they would put it in simple terms. But I think the big thing was back then too, there was a respect for police, and, you wouldn't get away if you were, like today, they call police names and verbal them and call them all sorts of things, and cops just keep walking. I mean, that didn't happen back then. Like when I grew up, if you did something wrong, the local sergeant, you'd get a size 12 boot up the arse, and, you'd learn quick smart. Because if your dad wasn't giving you a kick up the arse, and that's all changed now. But yeah, I think there was a lot of assault, drugs, murders. But I always try and look. I don't look at that as like that was bad or damaged me, because I don't think it did. I look at it that I was fortunate because when I got to learn, or other friends that went out to worked in the suburbs or even in the country. I'm fortunate that I never attended the death of a baby. Or I'm fortunate that I wasn't out in the country and turned up at a mangled wreck of a car with some dead kids in it. All that sort of stuff. I mean, we didn't have a lot of domestics. I think I attended a couple of domestics, and the both times it was two males, a gay couple or whatever, and we'd have a chat to them, and they'd make up, and it was all sort of cool. So yeah, if I had to deal with rural exploitation of kids and that, and cot death and things like that, I think that would have really knocked me around. But we didn't. Of course, we had runaway kids, and they were lost. Some of them, heroin at young ages, and that was upsetting. But I think compared to what other police did in the suburbs, I think I was fortunate that I didn't have to do that.
Tell us about how you did your policing, the culture of the police, because like at that time, prostitution was illegal. Of course, heroin was and remains illegal. And there was this intersection of powerful people involved. There was illegal casinos and these types of things. Tell us about the culture of the police. Was there a rule book on what you policed, when you policed, and how you policed it?
Yeah. Look, it was an unwritten law. You may recall a gentleman, a criminal who's passed now, a colourful character called Tim Bristow. So I interviewed Tim Bristow on a TV show many, many years ago, back in the early 90s. And we were brought up corruption. And I said, no, corruption's really bad, and cops do it. They deserve the book thrown at them and that. And he shook his head and he said, you're naive, Manny. I said, why is that, Tim? And he said, you know what I found? He said, the higher up I went in society, he said, the greater the corruption. And that's what people, people always point the finger at cops did this, but back in those days, it did stem, from the top. I mean, we're talking, Norm Allen and all that sort of stuff. But there's two things I remember distinctly. One was I was at King's Cross. We were doing a foot patrol in Kellett Street. We walked past this building, these massive big doors, and these two monsters out the front. And the guy I'm working
This is the back alley off the back of Darlinghurst, right?
Yeah, just off Bayswater Road.
Yep.
And I said, what's in there? He said, oh, mate, it's gambling, And I said, but it's illegal. Like, why aren't we going back in there and locking them up? He said, nah. He said, mate, if we went in there, he said, half the prominent people in town would be in there having a bet, right? So I guess you turned a blind eye to that. Another thing I remember, I'm working at Darlinghurst police station one night shift, and must have been around midnight or something, 1 o'clock. I'm at the inquiry counter, and this skinny lady walks up, dressed sort of provocatively. It was obviously a sex worker. And under her arm, she had a case of VB cans, and she plonked it up on the counter. I said, hi, can I help you? And she asked for a particular sergeant. And before I could call him, because directly opposite was his office, he'd heard her, and he came out, hey, darling, gave her a kiss and a cuddle, and, he probably had a feel as well. And then he showed her into the charge room, and I'm sitting there, like, what's going on here? So I popped my head in a couple of minutes later, and there they all are. They're sitting there, they're having a beer and everything, and they're having a laugh, and she's telling some stories, and everyone's having a laugh. And I then hear her say that the Vice Squad boys will be up in like 20 minutes. So then I see her go around the back of the charge room. There was this open area, and up against the wall was a little sort of desk, and that's where you'd fingerprint people. And I popped my head around there. She is putting the ink on her hand, and she's fingerprinting herself, like basically filling the form up. And they go in there, so they put the charge into the book for soliciting, because back then they'd go to court, they get a $50 fine. Sure enough, 25 minutes later, two boys from the Vice Squad come in. How are you? They signed the charges. They then gave her a lift back to where she was working. So it was charging by appointment. Yeah. And it was like, so they didn't have to, set up a stakeout and do all this sort of stuff. So they would just go around and say, you're getting charged today. The girls would go up there. They'd only be off the street less than an hour, so they're not losing a lot of money. They'd get fined $50 when they went to court. And, it would show the Vice Squad had arrested X amount of prostitutes that day. And yeah, I mean, you look at it and people will think, oh, yeah, that's a bit crazy. But I mean, at the end of the day, what were they, even the gambling? Like, look at the gambling we have now. Like, you can't watch the footy or anything with all this gambling. The only reason it was illegal, seriously, was because the government wasn't getting a take out of it.
Yeah, they weren't getting a take.
That's right.
They weren't getting a tax.
Yeah,
As soon as they realised that they could make a buck out of it,
Exactly.
all the SPs became the TAP.
Yeah. So that's why it was illegal, Of course, gambling and prostitution, I mean, it leads to other crimes, and, the people associated, especially with prostitution, can be fairly nefarious. But that was the way it was done then, So, I mean, when you'd be driving past, but you wouldn't stop and lock them up. I mean, I think the only, prostitutes sex workers that I ever charged was one who was drugging clients. When they were, unconscious, she'd steal from them. So, I mean, that was the only thing like that, stealing from clients or whatever. I mean, for being sex workers, no.
What about I read an essay from 1979. It was in the National, I think, Inquirer it was called "The Stations of the Cross," and there was quite a lot of street kids being exploited up there. That must have been tough to see what was going on there. Quite high profile cases of pedophiles and all the rest. It must have been tough to see that on the street.
Look, it was, because I guess, in many cases, if the kid's 15, 16, they're like five years younger than me. And when they were younger, and it was tough, and you would try to do, what you could. So I guess what I used to do is sort of round them up and, take them to the train station and, warn them off, get lost out of here, But they would all invariably find themselves back. I mean, you mentioned about pedophilia and all that. I mean, there was a place somewhere up there called Costello's, where there were young sex workers. It was frequented by people who, were very prominent. Why that place was never closed down, I don't know. But it was one of those things, I think, you come out of the academy and you're going to change the world. And I was no different. Everyone's like that. But it didn't take me long to discover that no matter what I did, I wasn't going to change the world. But I could make
it had all been greenlit by the politicians and the senior police.
Yeah.
They called it the joke, didn't they?
Yeah. So you can't change the world, but I could still make a difference. So that's what I would do. I would try to help where I could. There was a young boy one day. I'll call him Shane. I think he was about 14, 15, and in the middle of the day, he was like asleep in a little alcove of a closed store. And I sort of woke him up and, mate, what are you doing? And in those days, you could stop, search and detain anyone. You just needed reasonable cause. Your own gut feeling was enough. And I searched him, and he had a key to a suite at the Seabull Townhouse. Now, the Seabull Townhouse back then was the best hotel in Sydney. Everyone, Elton John, they all stayed there, all the stars. And immediately, I took him back to the police station. I think, well, he's been knocking stuff off or something. So he's going, no, look, it's my friend. He said I could stay there, You're not going to believe him. So I rang the Seabull Townhouse, got the manager on side, gave him the room number and said, there's been break-ins, something happened. And he came back and he was very, very coy. And he proceeded to tell me that there was someone who back then was well known in media circles, and that he had booked the room, and that the young boy had been there for a couple of days and there'd been no break-in, no anything. And I said, oh, right. So the penny dropped. Okay, I know what's going on now. So I hung up and I looked at young Shane, and he was crying, and I said, mate, you're not in trouble. It's all good. I just had to check, I said, don't cry. Oh, I guess whether he felt embarrassment, shame, whatever. But I sort of thought about it, and I thought, well, why are you sleeping in an alcove? So I gave him the key back, and I said, mate, the room's booked for the rest till tomorrow. I said, don't sleep in there. Go back there. I said, order some food. I said, go back there, and because I'm thinking, well, if old mate has had his whatever, his pleasure or whatever with this poor kid, well, at least the kid should be, stay in the hotel, because the guy had booked out, so he'd gone, so I wasn't sending him back there. But the room was still booked. He left it for the kid. So I gave him the key and I said, yeah. And then, I guess I got to know him, and I'd always ask if he was okay and that. So, yeah.
One of one of the things that kept this corruption going, there were some pretty bad hombres, operating in and around the cross. You had some real enforcers through that period who were making sure that that sort of corrupt order was maintained. People paid their debts. If someone was blackmailing someone and that hadn't been greenlit. Did you ever hear, like, I know that there was quite a notorious murderer, one of the Murphy boys, Les Murphy, who went on with others to kill Anita Cobby. Did you ever hear of run into any of these sort of characters or hear of these people? Did you ever hear of Ivan Milat or any of his cohort ever being in and around the cross?
No, never heard of Milat. As I said, I was there, I think the mid 80s to early 90s. So obviously the backpacker killings, I think the first bodies were discovered before he was arrested in 94, of course. But no, I hadn't heard of that. Look, I think I heard of obviously Abe Saffron, never saw him. George Freeman, but never saw him. When I was there, I mean, the guys that were I guess you'd call them the so-called heavies, or the ones that were most visible were the Bayer guys, Louis and Bill Bayer.
Yep.
And you just see them, in coffee shops having coffee, and there was always, someone that looked like quite heavy, whether it was a guard or whatever. But it was those sorts of guys. But the difference that I see between now and the guys back then, the tough guys didn't want to be seen. The Saffrons, the Freemans, all the tough guys, they didn't want to be seen. They went about their business quiet because they weren't stupid. If they're causing a commotion, well, the cops are going to come down hard on them.
It's a really interesting point because I read and we found we've been doing some research on, and we'll get to it on murdered and missing people. But we found a headline from the Herald or the Mirror. Can't remember which one, from 1966, and it was the year of murder and mayhem in the Cross. In Sydney, and there were 9 unsolved homicides in and around inner Sydney, some of them quite brutal. And at that time, 65, Askin had come in. He'd basically greenlit these illegal casinos. There was this period of bloodshed on the streets, 65, 66, and the suggestion is that it was essentially the corrupt powers said, you can't do that. You can't be killing each other on the streets, and we can't have bodies lying everywhere. Make sure that this is all kept behind closed doors. So if you're getting rid of people, put them on a boat out through Sydney Heads, plop them in the water. We don't want these people turning up, dead in back alleys everywhere, because then we've got a problem. And so it was sort of organised, wasn't it? Literally, organised crime.
But it makes sense. I mean, like you look at now, there's certain, whether the Middle Eastern crime families are shooting each other in the street and that. Well, what happens?
Yeah.
When the cops put together a task force of 300, they start, kicking heads. I mean, it was bad for business. But I think the old crims were like that. They kept a low profile because they didn't want to attract anyone. And look, as I said,
I know that Abe Saffron hated being in the press. Like there's very few photos of him. You see other sort of younger gangsters these days, and they're all over Instagram. There's like 3,000 photos that usually help incriminate them, where they are and what they're doing. And here's my new white Lamborghini.
But all you're doing is putting your head in the spotlight.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I don't know if they're as bright as the old ones there. But, like as I said, you wouldn't see the major players around, or especially not me as a junior constable. Now, whether the more experienced detectives or whatever, I mean, I'm sure they dealt with them. I mean, you've got to you become a detective, you've got to have your sources and that, and those sources normally come from the criminal underworld because they've got their ear to the ground. So, but I mean, didn't see that. I mean, for us, it was just, as I said, people coming in from the suburbs, or overseas, going to this place that I guess was I mean, it was the most exciting, crazy place in Australia.
I remember it. I remember the first time I went there in the early 90s. I ended up at the Bourbon and Beefsteak dancing with Ricky Ponting and a couple of transvestites.
Was that
Ricky got beaten up.
Yeah, I was going to say that was the night that one of the bouncers gave him one. Yeah,
and he had
I remember that.
he had to turn up a couple of days later with two black eyes.
Yeah.
And that was, you just rub shoulders with rock stars and street people from the street and politicians and the like. So you moved up through the cops. Did you end up becoming a detective?
Yeah. So what happened is I was at Darlow maybe a year, and then I got transferred down to King's Cross.
Yep.
And I remember the sergeant who told me I was going down there. Sort of said, no, or the inspector was, no, I want you to go down there because I know you're going to do work and stuff like that. So I got down there, and then it was funny. I had a mate at headquarters, a senior public servant. I was a young single guy, so I applied for a transfer to Tweed Heads, on the border of the Gold Coast. I mean, it's just going to be the best place to work. And normally you'd have to go out to Narrabri or, Burke or something for 3-4 years to get there. Anyway, he, because I had my mate, he put me at the top of the list. And only 3-4 months after, he rings me. He said, "Mate, you're up there in 6 weeks. You start." I said, "Oh, it's unreal." So I'm thinking, this is brilliant. And then I was at the Cross at the time in uniform, and I turned up for afternoon shift, and we had a telephone message pad, and there was a message there from Keith Smith, who was the boss of Darlinghurst Detectives, and it was, come and see me. So I got in the car, and I sort of went up there, and I was nervous. Like, have I done something wrong? Am I in trouble? And walked into Darlinghurst Police Station, and I think it was 2 or 3 flights of stairs up to where the other detectives were, and sort of got to the door of Keith's office, and he saw me and said, "Mate, come in." He said, "Don't be nervous. You've done nothing wrong. Sit down." I said, "Okay." So I sat down, and then he pushed this green form in front of me, and it was a transfer form. And then he said, "Oh, I've been looking at your work, and, you're doing good work, and, I think you'd make a great detective, so sign that." He'd filled it out for me, so I signed it. And then I went back, and then I rang headquarters and said, "Oh, I'm not going to Tweed Heads. I'm joining Darlinghurst Detectives." And that's how I got into it. And back then it was.
And what does that mean? What does that mean? So you're clearly working on more serious crimes, that sort of thing. How do they delineate it? What does that mean?
Well, basically, so to become a detective, what you're obviously working. You're a plainclothes constable. And then you do a potential criminal investigators course, which I did, which was 6 weeks. And then about a year later, you'd go back, or a couple of years later, and do another 3-week course. And then you get what's called designated. Unfortunately, I never got the chance to do the last one to get designated. But yeah, it's more serious crimes, serious assault, serious drugs. So people would come in and make a report. And there'd be 3 copies of the report. One would get, a couple we had filed. And then when it was a serious matter, one would get sent up to the detectives. So then, the boss would give you that, let's say it's an armed robbery or something, or an assault and rob, or a sexual assault, and then you take over the case. So that was it. The uniformed guys would normally take it, unless, detectives were on hand, they turned up straight away, which would normally happen on real serious ones, like a murder. Uniform might be the first to get there, but immediately, detectives get there, and then homicide squad, and so that was basically it, just looking at the more serious stuff.
And you've got you're tasked with getting that case, solved and all the way through to court and hopefully a prosecution.
Yeah.
So a big step up, but you got to have a pretty analytical mind, and you must have a pretty, like turning up to a murder, like it's pretty tough stuff.
Yeah, oh look, it is. But as I said, I was really junior in that, so I'd be there just standing behind the seasoned detectives, and we'd just be doing, I guess, simple tasks like we'd always do, do a knock on houses in the area to see if anyone had heard anything. So we had things called running sheets back then. No sort of computers. Everything was sort of on running sheets that went into big folders and that. But yeah, look, there's some terrible cases you turn up at, and I think what it does is, once again, it questions your belief in humanity, that people could do something so cruel to someone, and that sort of stuff. But yeah, I mean, it's life, and I guess what you've got to do, as if you're a cop and you're doing it, what you want to do is you want to get some justice for that person, and some answers for their family. Because it's like, I guess that's why I'm so passionate about missing people, because there can't be anything, I think, more troubling than losing a family member or someone going missing and you don't know what's happened and you have no answers. And in the case of missing people, you don't know whether they're alive or not. And even if someone's been murdered, you want that justice. You want to know why, and the reason most of the time is ludicrous. There's no real reason for it, but you want to know that whoever committed the crime, sees justice.
And how did you cope with it? Because the culture back then was one like PTSD wasn't even a term.
No.
Trauma, something like that. Was it? How did you seem like a very disciplined person. How did you deal with it? Did you go for a run, or did you drink 15 schooners, or how did you deal with it?
Well, I think 99% of police dealt with it by drinking 15 schooners. I didn't sort of drink back then. So, I'd be there sort of just with my, my lemon squash and that. I mean, that was the way, the culture, then how they dealt with it. I didn't, things would affect me in that, like I said, that first deceased that I attended, but it wasn't something I held on to. It was sort of, I guess I took it and thought, well, okay, if I can help someone who's in a similar position, or, in this case, if it's someone that's deceased, I want to find a friend or a family member so that they're there when they're at their funeral to give them a fair send off. So I didn't really get as I said, I think I just dealt with it. I think I have a strong personality and I was able to deal with it. But most police would be down the pub, 10, 15 schooners, and you talk about it, and then you'd do it again. But there was a lot of police that were damaged, from things they saw, and the alcohol can only numb it for a little while. I'm happy to say that now that part of the job, the stresses and that, is really well looked after. So police hopefully get looked after a lot better than back then, but we didn't understand it. The PTSD, like you said, didn't exist. And the other thing was, if you got upset or you showed you were depressed about something, well, in that, especially the detectives.
It's pretty macho.
Well, it's macho. I was like, get over it, you weak prick. That sort of stuff, right? So I guess you couldn't show that sort of weakness or that things were getting to you too much.
So you're a cop for how long? 7 or 8 years?
Yeah.
And then early 90s, you thought, I've had enough. Bit of a career change. You make the flip to journalism. How and why did you do that?
Well, it wasn't my choice. If it was still up to me, I'd still be in the police today. I decided that was my lifelong career. But unfortunately, back towards the late 1980s, I was working at King's Cross Detectives, and the majority of the police there were good, honest coppers. But we had a couple of bad apples in there. And back then, they also had a mob called the Internal Police Security Unit. So it wasn't internal affairs, Internal Police Security Unit. And they also had a couple of corrupt blokes in there. And they had what was the word? They operated along the lines of, you sunk a cop, another cop, you got promoted. So you had some overzealous people in there who looked beyond what the evidence was, and it was just all out about sinking cops. And unfortunately for me, I turned up at work one day and morning shift, and Chuck Fowler was the boss, and he sent me home. He said, so-and-so's on sick leave now, you've got to work with this particular sergeant. And we were working that night, and then we got a call from uniform police. They'd pulled over what they thought was a stolen car. It had been stolen, been recovered, but they hadn't updated the information. So the guy driving was a drug dealer, and his girlfriend, a prostitute, and they searched into the glove box. I think there was about $3,000 and drugs. So we had the pagers back then. That went off, and I was there was a bar called Barron's.
I know it. I went there upstairs.
Yeah. So I was in there with this sergeant. He's on the piss, and I'm bored shitless, thinking, can we just do some work anyway? So when that came through, I was stoked. Oh wow, we got a job. So I prized him away from there, and we went up to the Sydney Police Centre, and there was, I think there was 2 uniform cars, so 4 coppers there, and there was a prostitute and this drug dealer, and they had showed us what they'd found. It was money and drugs, and it was a police officer, Constable Newing, and in the hour or two that they'd made the arrest and we got there, he'd done a list called the Newing list, and it was a very itemised, precise list. How many notes, like $10, $50 notes, $10, all that, and the drugs. So we were up there, and I was in the room with the officers, and the sergeant was in the other room with the drug dealer. And then he called me in, and he said, "Oh, we're going to let the prostitute go because this bloke's going to give up his dealer and give us information," which is what happened. And he's the sergeant. I've been in there. I'm a junior officer. Yeah, okay. So we do a quick record of interview where he says, "Yeah, the drugs are mine and they're not hers or anything." I then go back into the room where the female was. She'd already been searched, right? So to let her go. But I said to the uniform guy, I said, "Go get a policewoman. I want her searched again." And they said, "Oh, she's already been searched." I said, "Oh, I don't care. I want her searched again." So they searched her a second time, and they found a small sealable bag of, I think it was speed or something, down in her underpants. So I went back inside of the sergeant. I said, "Well, she's got this on her." And he said, "Oh, don't worry, just add it to this bloke's. He's going to give up his dealer, let her go." So that's it. I never hear anything about it, nothing at all. And I don't know, maybe 8, 9 months pass. They do a big raid on King's Cross Detective's office. Ted Pickering's there with Lau, and they both hated each other at the time. And they do this big thing, "Oh, yeah, King's Cross police, they're all corrupt and they're all crooks." Well, there's 28 of us, right? There was a couple of crooks in the office apart from this sergeant. But somehow these other 2 people were given complete indemnity without officially being given indemnity. So they did this big thing, and they realised that basically, other than this sergeant, everyone else was pretty straight. So they needed a couple of fall guys. And unfortunately, me and another guy, with the 2 most junior guys, became the fall guys. So this drug dealer is in custody 6, 7, 8 months, does 20 statements, 20 records of interview, never mentions me. Nothing at all. He then does his record of interview with a guy from internal security who begins it with a leading question, which you're not allowed to do leading. And it's something along the lines of, "Do you agree in an earlier conversation you express your desire to tell me of your dealings with a detective Caroutas known as Meni Caroutas?" The fact you remembered my name was a joke, right? Oh, yeah. So he then proceeds to say that on that night, the sergeant I was with stole some of the money and that I was witness to it. So I get interviewed by this guy from internal security. The sergeant's in jail because he was involved in another big conspiracy. I'm the only one that has the brief, all right? And I'd been transferred to Redfern for a few months. So he asked me about the brief. Didn't know I had it. I knew what was coming. I could have destroyed it. I handed it to him voluntarily. Yeah, here it is. I got nothing to hide. And I was seeing the police doctor because I was really stressed. And he says, "You got leave?" I said, "I got about 10 weeks. He said, "Go and on holiday because this is really stressful. You need a break." So I applied for leave, went on leave. About 2-3 weeks before I came back, my older brother Chris rings me and said, "Listen, I've had a phone call from someone and you're going to get locked up when you come back." I said, "What? I beg your pardon?" He said, "Oh, I'm just telling you, if you've done something wrong, don't come back." I told him to go F himself. I arrived back, went through, nervous, of course, on the plane. I go through, grab my bags. I'm then called over. They search my bags, find nothing. And then as I'm about to leave, 2 plainclothes federal coppers come and they go, "Oh, mate, we're federal police, come with us." So I'm taken to an office, and then this guy from internal security, another guy are both there. And they proceed to tell me that I'm going to be charged with conspiracy to pervert the course of justice or whatever. And of course, I'm in shock. And then we get in the back of the car. They got to drive me to Mascot where I'm going to be charged. And I said, "I'll be getting bail, sir." And he said, "No, you won't be getting bail." And I said, "Why not?" It's the severity of the charges, right? My family had been in
That
business.
must have freaked the shit out of you.
Freaked the shit out of me. My family had been in business for 35, 40 years. When we went to the reason he put down for refusing bail was a lack of family ties. So I completely lied, right? And then there was the bail sergeant at Mascot was, probably the biggest asshole I've ever met. Another cop could see me, a young kid, broken, and proceeded to try and humiliate me, like ask me, name, date of birth. And when he said occupation.
So you're still in your 20s?
Right, I'm a kid, mid-20s. And I said, he asked me my occupation. I said, police officer. And he muttered, fucking police officer. And mate, I was shattered. I think my brother then had got his mate who was a lawyer, came to the to Mascot Police Station to the cell door. I'm obviously crying. I'm freaking out. I can't believe what's going on. Even though I'd had that bad experience with that arsehole, the bail sergeant at Mascot, there was another guy called Jock, an old English senior constable. And they took me to Maroubra Police Station because they didn't have cells at Mascot. And he was really, really good. He said, mate, keep your head up and all that. And I think that probably stopped me from doing anything stupid. But I'll never forget a guy after the afternoon shift finished, and I'm laying in this fucking cell thinking, what the hell's going on? And this guy came, and never met him. He had heard what had happened, and he came to the door and he said, hey, mate. And I said, yeah. And he said, listen, keep your head up, champ. Don't whatever. Keep positive. Yeah, okay. So the next day, it's a Monday, I get taken to Central Police Station, and lo and behold, there's no objection to bail. Absolutely no objection to bail. But when I get there, there's a sergeant, a guy called Banks was his surname, who used to be at Darlinghurst, knew me. He was in charge of the cells at Central, knew who I was. He places me in the cell number 1, which is the large cell, right? So I'm sitting there, broken, completely broken. Over the next half hour, the cell fills with more than 20 prisoners from the metropolitan jails attending court, right? I'm a cop in there. A young Indigenous boy who I'd locked up when I was at Redfern, only probably less than a year earlier, comes over, sits next to me and says, where do I know you from, mate? Where do I know you from? And I jokingly said, oh, mate, you've probably seen me on TV. I start freaking out, if they find out who I am.
Who you are.
Yeah. Luckily,
they kill you.
It did. And luckily, a sergeant of mine from King's Cross, Kim Thompson, he came into the cell, saw I was there, went up to this guy, Banks, and said, what are you doing? And he said, because you're a cop, he doesn't get special treatment. And Kim told him, basically threatened him, get him out of there. And I'd been in there an hour, think about it, or I'll fucking bash you. Anyway, so they got me out there, I went up, got bail. Anyway, the matter went to court, thrown out by a magistrate. Now, a case like mine, where a cop is charged, you would normally go straight up to a judge, but it was riddled with holes. And I think the biggest thing which just showed the setup that had happened was I mentioned that Newing list. So on the second or third day of my committal, the DPP solicitor was a man and a woman. We're having morning tea. She handed that Newing list to my lawyer. He says, what's this, Manny? I said, shit myself. That's a Newing list. I'm thinking, because I did the exhibit entry after we took over, I counted the money and the drugs and put in the exhibit. So I'm thinking they've dropped it on me because there's going to be a discrepancy. I'm freaking out. So we get the exhibit entry and we compared it, all right? And there was a discrepancy. You know what it was? My entry had one extra bag of speed, the one I'd found on the prostitute. There was no discrepancy whatsoever. The DPP solicitor took the box, and my bloke said, where's this been? Caroutas handed you, that brief, or you've had it for months, da-da-da. She then proceeded she mentioned a sergeant of police who I've never met before, that on the Friday before the Monday the committal started, at 5 o'clock took it down and gave it to them. To this day, I still don't know the explanation or the circumstances. And then this guy from internal security who, the one that set me up, took the box. My bloke said, mate, Caroutas gave you the brief. Well, how is it that every document, except the one that, completely blows
your
the
case out of
the water, he goes, there were loose documents in it, da-da-da. Anyway, and then we caught him. After that, this all came out. The following day, we had the guy that made the allegation, the drug dealer, was in the box, and this inspector of police went and spoke to him in the cells during cross-examination, right, about changing his evidence because it proved that he'd been lying. And then when he took the box, we said, "What are you doing talking to him during cross-examination?" He said, "Oh, his wife rang me and asked me if I could take him a packet of cigarettes." Yeah,
Wow.
yeah. And 2 weeks after he charged me, he was promoted to chief inspector, right? And
So one of the good cops, like the second in your class out of Goulburn, worked the streets, coming up as a detective, just thrown under the bus because they had to find someone.
Fall guy.
Fall guy,
Because they protected these two other guys who should have hit the dock back then in the King's Cross detectives. I don't know what happened, or they did a deal. Something happened, and yeah, so they did that. And as I said, a case like this gets 99% of the time goes upstairs. I mean, the magistrate saw what was happening. He threw the matter out. He awarded $100,000 costs against the police. And on the day it happened, there would have been 15, 20 cops in the back of there supporting me, which was great. I then made a complaint about what had happened to me. Made a complaint about that sergeant at Central Cells, right? So there was a whole heap of complaints. The fact that they refused me bail, they lied, they said I had no family ties. So in regards to the sergeant, this guy Banks at Central Cells, they got the cell book and they found they got a handwriting expert, it had been altered, changed from 1 to 3, right? He lied and said, no, he put me in a single cell. And then when they saw it, I didn't recognise him, right? Nothing happened to him, absolutely nothing. So, I made a complaint. They were doing nothing, under the carpet. I went to the Ombudsman, and when I turned up at the Ombudsman, one of the senior guys from Internal Police Security Unit was working there. So my faith in them doing an investigation was nothing. I was very fortunate then that Neil Mercer, who was at the ABC, heard about it, contacted me to do a story, and subsequently he got called away on another assignment overseas, and went to the 7:30 report. So they did a story, a whole 30-minute show on what happened to me and how my career was ruined and the corruption, around what happened to me. That was on a Monday. On the Tuesday, the inspector from Internal Security set me up, went on sick leave. Within 2 weeks, he received a full medical discharge, right, with all his payments and super and everything. And I remember I wrote a letter to the Deputy Commissioner at the time, and I said, you shuffled him out the back door of headquarters like a thief in the night, and that's it. And even now, to this day, I've never had an explanation. No one's ever been held accountable.
And so what did you do? Did you resign from the police? Did you walk?
No. So what happened after I go public, I have, I think it was another assistant commissioner or deputy commissioner. I applied for a medical discharge. But when I was on the 7:30 report, I was very fortunate that someone saw me on there, a TV producer who was putting a show called Hard Copy together. And I got a phone call one day from a lady saying, oh, hi, my brother is doing this show and, he's interested in maybe if you want to be a reporter and that, Now, when you go through something you go through, you don't think good things are going to happen. So I thought it was someone being an arsehole. So I just said, get lost and hung up. Luckily, they rang back. And then I had a meeting and all that. And they, I said, oh, I was naive. Do I have to do a screen test? No, we've got the 7:30 thing. You'll be fine. You just got to decide whether you want to go back to the cops. I didn't want to leave the police. I loved it. But they took away any confidence I had in them. They protected this guy, Internal Security, who was a crook. They ruined my career. There was no explanation, no nothing. And I'm thinking, well, I've just gone public and given it to them. I mean, I'm going to be looking over my shoulder, the rest of my career. I mean, they've obviously got the shits with me because they're not interested in justice and not interested in the truth. And I'm talking about the hierarchy back then.
And this is the early 90s. This is pre-Wood Royal Commission where some of the top people in the New South Wales Police were some of the most corrupt people in the country.
Yeah, so I applied
and they threw all kinds of good cops under the bus.
They did. So I applied for a medical discharge and then they're saying, no, you're not going to get a medical discharge. And then I called for a meeting and there was a whole heap of senior police and this senior public servant who was just a dick. And there was a deputy commissioner there, and I was just very straightforward. I was very respectful. he said, "Oh, Meni, if you want to work in television, we've got the media unit. You can work here, or maybe you want to go back to Wollongong, close to your family, or North Coast, wherever you want, Meni. You just tell us, And I said, "Look, sir, I could never trust you guys. You've ruined my career. You've protected the people that did it to me, and I haven't had an answer or an explanation for anything." I said, "I just want, what I'm entitled to, which is a medical discharge because of what you've done to me. And if I don't get it, I'm going to go public again." And he goes, "Oh, no, you don't want to do that." And I said, "Well, I will." I said, and there was a couple of things that I hadn't made public the first time. And basically they pointed to a huge conspiracy to pervert the course of justice involving the hierarchy. So I sort of went over that, and he's busily taking down notes and turned white.
They got balls of steel, mate.
Well, mate, they ruined me.
You had no choice.
What they did to me. I mean, the prick knew I was innocent, wanted to send me to jail. So I stood up and I said, "I'll be waiting with bated breath." And got in a lift with a lawyer and the guy from the association, a lovely man called Greg Chilvers, and he was, he couldn't believe it. He turned white. "I can't believe you said that." And I said, "You know what they tried to do to me, mate? Like, this isn't small shit."
Yeah.
Anyway, and I think it was 3 weeks later, I got a medical discharge and started in the media.
So there you go, mate. What a tale.
Yeah.
You lived to tell, but, good for you, mate. You over to hard copy, and you make the seamless transition to being a TV reporter, working for hard copy. Were you based in New South Wales, or were you in Queensland?
No, here we were in Clark Street originally in Willoughby.
Yep.
So, it was a production company called Showboat Productions, a gentleman called Peter Sutton, who married Kay Cotty, the great sailor who first lady to sail solo around the world. And to this day, I'm thankful and very grateful that he gave me this opportunity. Obviously, he saw something in me, but also he was a smart operator. I mean, because of what I'd gone through, it was in paper, it was on TV. It was a great way to promote the show as well by bringing me in. So, but I had an opportunity, and look, it wasn't seamless. It was tough. I'd never done that sort of stuff before. There was no producer, no nothing. It was just, here you go, go do stories.
But you could handle tough subject matter. You could front people up and ask them the hard questions, and also do the hard doorknock.
Yeah, it was just the writing, whatever. But what ended up happening, I mean, there were other reporters there, and I'd download their or print off their scripts, and I'd look at the way they'd written the script, and it was just through practice that I learned, and then just kept going from there.
One of the cases then that led to the work you're doing is the case of Daniel Morecambe. You picked that up as an issue, and that was a young boy headed out Christmas shopping, 2003, I think it was, disappeared. It just totally shocking because one of the key things is, and it's tragic, is when a lot of young people go missing from the street, if they're street kids, well, there's not the outcry because people say, "Oh, well, this is what happens on the street to these kids that come from broken homes." But Daniel Morecambe, from a loving home, disappears, shocked the nation, absolutely shocked the nation. I was on the Gold Coast. I remember driving down the highway, and there was a mannequin by the side of the road, and it was like a sign, a mannequin saying, "Have you seen Daniel?" And they had him dressed the way he was. And I'm not sure if that was at the time or a couple of years later, but I still remember that. And this is before the internet. And have you seen Daniel? And I was like, what the fuck is that about? But Daniel Morecambe, tell us about that. And that must have been, continue to be, because, well, there's been a conviction since on that case. But
Brett Cohen.
Brett Cohen, but that took a long time. And when it comes to missing, because I've heard you talk about this previously, one of the difficulties with missing children is a lot of the time that the parents have different views. Daniel's father was like, "I've lost my son, he's gone, he's dead." The mother holds out hope. Walk us through that case, mate, because I think that was really pivotal for you, wasn't it, in the work you do now?
Well, it was, because I think I'd only recently become a dad for the first time. My daughter Bella was born, and I was working for, it was Today Tonight. I was a senior reporter in Brisbane, and within only a couple of weeks, I think I interviewed the family and subsequently did more stories. And then maybe 6-7 years later, I was making a show called Missing Persons Unit, and I did another series on them. And yeah, I mean, when anything that involves children, is tough to accept, because children are innocent and they need to be protected. And when you've got a predator that goes after kids, I think it really shatters the fabric of society. And I remember the first interview I did with them just weeks after, at their home, and Bruce and Denise Morecambe are, you won't meet two better people, but you could see and you could feel the heartache, and even just doing media, and I'm always conscious whenever I talk to someone, it's really difficult, and they do it not because they enjoy it, they do it because they're hoping that it'll lead to a resolution, and they're hoping that somehow we'll be able to find their loved one. But yeah, Daniel's case was just horrible, because an innocent child, but doing something that was so Australian. He was going to the shops, get a haircut, and buy Christmas presents for his family, like something so heartwarming. And unfortunately, he was taken by Brett Cohen and murdered, and it took many years. And I believe it was the biggest police investigation in Queensland history. And the police did an incredible job, especially they did an operation to entrap Cohen, which was just incredible. Really, really brilliant work. But Bruce and Denise were the ones that never gave up, and this case remained constantly in the media.
Yeah, well,
no matter how many years. And
not only did they not give up, but the people in the media didn't give up.
But it was Bruce and Denise that drove that.
Yeah, they did, didn't they?
Yeah, and that's I guess the thing with these cases go cold, but not every family has that. I don't know whether the word strength is the word, or determination. I mean, they all want resolution, but Bruce and Denise were something different. They would organise day for Daniel and all this sort of stuff. And they just kept on it, kept on to the police and kept on it. And finally, they were able to find out what happened to their son. And it was tragic. They just found some of Daniel's remains. But I can't stress enough how important it is for families to know what happened and to have somewhere to go and, sort of pay their respects. They have somewhere now where they can go, lay flowers and pay their respects. For so many other families of missing people, they've got nothing. They've got nothing. They've got a photo, don't know where their loved one is. And even though all the circumstances will point and say that they're no longer alive, it was like with Bruce and Denise that you mentioned. Bruce, very early on, I think he believed that he'd never see Daniel alive again. Whereas Denise, even up until I think the time they found his remains, and this is the strength of a mother's love. And I remember her saying to me, when I did one story where after 6-7 years, they finally packed up his clothes in it, and we put it in a storage unit. It was a very emotional scene. And I said, you're keeping all these clothes in that. Like, if he ever does come back, he'll be, older and they won't fit him in that, Do you still think that he'll come back? And she said, yeah, because I do. She says, I have to keep believing. I have to have that hope, because you hear often, like in America, kids that have been abducted, they return all these years later, so you can't, and that's what's really horrible when you don't know, because even though all the evidence, common sense tells you the person's not alive, it's human nature just to still have that hope that maybe they are.
Exactly. You have that hope, and people want that finality. They want to know the details of what happened to their loved one. One of the work you've been doing more recently is the Missing Australia. You've written books, and I know you've got a book coming out soon, which is Someone Somewhere Knows Something.
Yep.
Which is about, and that's coming out in July, isn't it?
2nd of July.
2nd of July. So check that out, people. Meni Caroutas there. But that really is about getting resolution, finality, finding out what happened, making sure that these families do. But also, one of the reasons I picked this issue up as a politician is to send a message to the society too, that we'll never stop looking. If you do these things, we will keep hunting you forever. You're not going to get away. We don't want you to get away with it. We're going to keep hunting for you. There's a fantastic group. It's Keep the Light On.
Yeah.
Keep the Light On. They're a group that you tell a story about Kay Doherty. Like her family literally kept the light on for her, didn't they?
Yeah. So Kay was a twin. She had a brother, Kevin Doherty.
Yep.
And along with another girl, Tony Kavanagh, went missing, I think it was 79 from Warilla down in Wollongong. And about 3-4 years ago, because I'm from the Gong, and I remember this case. I was at school, and we were all talking about it, and we got scared.
They were heading off to
a disco.
They were babysitting, but they were but good students and good kids and just doing what kids do.
Accepted a ride off the wrong person. And about 3-4 years ago, they had their Year 10 40-year reunion. And I attended there, and I produced a story there, interviewed people and that. And I think the episode's called Loss of Innocence. But yeah, it was really, really terrible. So Kevin, her brother, told me that the mum would leave the porch light on every night. Yes, okay. She came home. Now, when the parents died, I think they were living in public housing at the time. Kevin bought the house and still lives in it.
Amazing.
Yeah, after 40-something years, in case she comes home. Now, when he sits down and sort of speaks, openly and that, he knows she's not alive, but he's done what his mum would have done.
Yep.
So he's still, living in the house.
Just on that case, I think that was one of the ones where there was a letter sent, wasn't there?
2 letters, I believe.
Two letters. And what we've been doing research into this, and what we've discovered in that period there, both in Newcastle, in Wollongong, in North Sydney, there were about half a dozen at least incidents where young women disappeared and left strange notes, or just after they had disappeared, sent letters that seemed like they were written under duress to their family members. It seemed, and in different instances, there were strange parts, which were the story wasn't plausible. I've moved to the Gold Coast, or I'm going to see Billy up the coast and never seen again. Or in some instances, there were spelling errors or bad grammar when they knew the student was the kid was a good student and all the rest. It seemed that there was a period there where there was a sort of MO in these disappearances that was quite similar. Have you ever come across that?
Oh, look, I think the thing is that a lot of these cases can be linked, because of the MO, but also, if there's a predator out there and they make that's their thing, picking up young hitchhikers and hurting them and stuff like that, like Milat did. They don't stop, and I think the more they get away with, the more bolder they become. And I think the cold hard reality is you look at these cases, Kay and Tony. There were reports Milat was a suspect because he was working, around Wollongong or whatever at the time. Same with the girls in Newcastle.
Debbie Ashby.
Yeah. So it's easy to throw Milat up there, but I think the harsh reality is that there are other Milats out there. Ivan Milat wasn't the only one. He's not responsible for every missing, hitchhiker in New South Wales. There are other predators, and do that. And just recently, when I did the story on Gordana Kateski, who I think it was the 24th November 1994, young girl walking home from the shops, excited because she was going to her first concert, walking to her aunt's home, and she passes two guys in a white ute, and they abducted her. She's never seen again. These guys have never been caught. When that episode came out last year, a listener heard it, and it triggered the listener to come forward. And she contacted the task force that I had mentioned in the story, who are looking not only into Gordana's case, but all those girls from around Newcastle. This lady, very courageous lady, went in there and told her story, and police showed her photos, a lineup of some known predators, or sexual offenders. She picked a guy. The guy was in jail. He was jailed about 3-4 years ago for historical sex offences. So police, came to Sydney, pulled him out of jail, and charged him with that offence. 44 years ago it was. I can't commend this lady enough, the courage that she's displayed, but I'm happy to be able to report that just a couple of weeks ago, he appeared at court and he pled guilty to that.
To Gordana Kateski?
No.
No, another
case, this sexual assault. This young woman who heard the story came forward.
Oh,
so
yes.
she was abducted at knife point and
okay.
sexually assaulted
Yes.
back in 1980. So he's pled guilty to a case that's 44 years old.
Wow.
Yeah.
Look, there you go. What my interest in this has been simply because I lived in rural New South Wales and discovered in my little village of Bellingen there had been one disappearance where the coroner had found foul play. Two where the coroner had found foul play, and one person abducted and murdered in this tiny little village. And I thought, how can it be in a sort of 10-year period, there's 3 murders, it's unsolved, some real criticism of the level of inquiry by the police and, to the fact that in one of the disappearances, no one was ever interviewed. Like by the time there was a coronial inquest 20 years later, the police had presented no evidence of anyone they'd interviewed in relation to her disappearance. That was Miss Kylie. But I want to ask you about Ivan Milat, because I listened to your most recent podcast, The Missing, and you've started to talk about Ivan Milat. Now, we know some things about Ivan, and that was that he murdered these 7 backpackers and down in Belanglo. One of the things, I went to Belanglo and had a look at the site. One of the things that struck me about Belanglo was that for a lot of people it would seem remote, yet it's quite a busy forest. There's quite a lot of people come and go from that area. There's bushwalkers, orienteers found bodies. There's people who are hunting, mushroom pickers. There's, all kinds of different people down there. One of the things that struck me about Belanglo was, one, he'd taken people and murdered people to the exact same spot that he'd been before, which it shows a level of sort of indifference. I don't know, how these psychopaths really work, but he's that confident. He takes other people to the same place that he's murdered other people, and in Belanglo, they aren't in this super remote area. Like it may seem on a map, who would ever go there? But you actually go there, and where he's murdered these people is where the bodies are found. It's not that far from a road. It's only, maybe 100 metres or so from the road. The bodies weren't buried. They weren't burnt. There was material left there. A lot of evidence that helped convict him was left there. He was pretty brazen and confident, wasn't he, about that?
Well, I think he's a narcissist as well.
A narcissist. Yeah. That's exactly right. A psychopath, a narcissist. But the question has to be, are there other crimes? And Paul Gordon, a fascinating, amazing cop, really did crack the case in terms of Ivan. Well, tell us about him. Tell us about your interview with him, and tell us about who Paul Gordon was, and then I'll wrap it on.
Well, Paul Gordon, when I started at Darlinghurst, Paul Gordon was attached to Darlinghurst detectives. And as a young uniform guy, I joined the police, and that was always going to be my goal. I want to be a detective. And Paul and other guys there, I'd look at them, in awe. they wore suits and, they spoke in hushed tones and, they were the best of the best. He's a quiet guy, Paul. And never got to work with him because when I went to plainclothes, he'd left, and I think he sort of left, worked in suburban around the city detectives, and then in the homicide squad when they brought in a thing called regionalisation after the Woodrow Commission and trying to, they thought it was a way of stopping corruption where they didn't have squads anymore. Homicide squad, armed hold-up squad, consorters.
Special branch, all of this.
It was like
the breaking squad.
Yeah, so it'd be like regional, like a whole heap of Ds, and you do everything.
Yep.
You weren't specialised.
Yep.
Didn't work, so they've gone back to what it was. And Paul had been called into Task Force Air, which is the task force run by Clive Small to find the backpacker killer after the two English girls, Caroline and Joanne, after their bodies were discovered. And Paul I hadn't seen in so many years, right? So I'm, moved to Brisbane. I'm working for Channel 7 in 1999. Probably around 2000, 2001, I'm on a night out and I get into a cab and, give my address and we're driving. And after 5 minutes, I discover that the guy driving the cab, who seriously weighed 200 Ks, like big man, is Paul Gordon. And I'm shocked. Like, hey, Paul, how you going? And all that. Yeah, I'm all right, mate. Trying to find out what he's up to. Got to my place. I gave him my card. Give me a call, Never heard back from him, And it really disturbed me because I could see that he was damaged. He was hurt. He's living in a housing commission, I think, in Ipswich, and was driving cabs. And not that there's anything wrong with that, but I remember this big, tall, tough, very competent detective.
The guy that caught Malat.
Exactly. And I didn't really know too much about the story. I'd heard a little bit about it. And then maybe a year or so ago, Paul reached out to me through another policeman that we mutually knew and said he wanted to tell his story and that, And I said, mate, 100%. But he was very cautious as well. So it took a little while, and then, I brought him down to Sydney. And we did it was probably interviewed for about 2 hours, and it was very emotional, and you could tell he was hurt, from what he experienced and everything. But I wanted to give him the opportunity to tell his story, because he was very much responsible, along with other police, for cracking this case. And in the end, it cost him his career. I mean, he didn't see eye to eye with, Clive Small.
Have you read Small's book?
I have, yeah.
Yeah, Small really threw him under the bus.
Yeah, look, he does and he doesn't. But I guess what I would say, if Paul was so incompetent as, was claimed, I mean, Clive Small, I think there were 8-9 pages on Paul Gordon. You know what I mean? And there's nothing. He calls him incompetent, but that's it. So... Look,
also the other one, this suggestion that Paul had gone to the media to big note himself. It seemed like it counterintuitive. It's like, how are you going to get away with that if you're the person? You're clearly going to.
He was naive.
Yeah,
right? He wanted to go to the media because he was concerned that Clive Small, the way he was running things, would impact the success of the investigation and the prosecution. That's why he went there. And unfortunately, he was naive and, thought it was all off record and all this sort of stuff. And then the story came out, he's the hero, and it made it look like he was taking credit. That was never his intention, But I think what I took out of speaking to Paul, apart from, the impact that policing had on him, like he told me that there was an 18-month period when he was at Darlinghurst Detectives, right, where there were 18 murders in 18 months. That's got to have an impact on you, right? Now, when he went to the task force had been going, I think, for 3-4 months. He went there, I think, in January. Malat's arrested in May. So there were all these teams, teams of 2 or whatever, and there were many suspects, dozens of them. And he had a list of half a dozen or 8 suspects. Malat was one of them. So from the very beginning, he had the feeling it was Malat. And he would go to Clive Small, and Clive would go, no, go away and tell me why it's not him. which is fair enough because, you want to exhaust everything. If you lock someone up, you want to make sure it's the right guy. But then Paul, he said he knew there was something. He said there was a whole wall of running sheets, like those old folders of all these typed and written sheets. And he went in on a weekend and he spent the whole weekend looking through. And when he went through, he found the Onions report, the Lost Onions report, where you described being pulled over. And that basically...
This is Paul Onions, the backpacker, the British
guy,
backpacker.
Who escaped Malat.
Yeah, escaped Malat, got shot at on the Hume Highway, goes down to Bowral, makes a report, it gets lost, but he's then found. And then they find Paul in the UK.
Yeah, detectives fly over, they bring him here, they show him a group of photos, including Malat, and he picks him. So then, that become... So that was, as I said, that was really significant what Paul did. But also there was another gentleman he worked with, Dave McCloskey. And now police, even in the car, can go on there, put my name in there or your name, and it'll come up if you've got a criminal, everything. It's immediate, on the computer with the internet. Back in those days, everything was file, paper.
Yeah.
So they found some, the computers were very, very archaic, but it showed maybe some traffic offences for Malat. But Paul and Dave had this feeling, no, he's done something else. So Paul was at court one day and Dave had gone out to Parramatta, was the headquarters out there, the old Ferguson building, and he manually went through and he found the 1972 rape arrest and charging of Malat, where he picked up 2 hitchhikers in Liverpool, drove them to Goulburn and raped one of them.
At knife point.
Yeah, but then the girls were very, very calm and clever, and
one sort of acquiesced.
Yeah,
got away. Do you know when they got to the servo? When she ran into the servo, you know what she yelled? She said, "It's the Wanda Beach killer."
Oh, wow! No, I didn't know that. Wow.
Yeah, she said, "I don't." She said, "It's the Wanda Beach killer. I don't want to be the next Wanda Beach."
Wow, frightening.
Yeah, so pretty fascinating. But that, which Malat eventually, well, he disappears.
He goes overseas, so he's arrested and charged. But
well, did he go overseas? Because his uncle was called Ivan.
Oh, okay, yeah.
His uncle was called Ivan, and they wonder if the record of an Ivan Malat flying to New Zealand was the uncle.
Actually, I've read that recently, that he was here visiting his mum, still seeing his mum, and the family were looking after him. Yeah, but that was significant.
Maybe the family, maybe someone else.
Maybe, but that was significant because it showed modus operandi, MO. You pick up backpackers, hitchhikers, you sexually assault them, and he let them live. So those 2 things discovered by Paul and David really flipped the investigation and led to the arrest of Ivan Malat.
And then they found mountains of evidence.
Everything.
They found everything, and
the rifle,
the rifle parts, the ballistics convicted him, and backpacks and DNA and the whole thing. But there's 2 things that emerge out of Malat that I think are unresolved. One is clearly was someone else there at Belangolo? Did he operate with other people? Because abducting 2 people while you're driving a car, in one instance we know with Gaber Nurgebauer, it's a big, strong, German guy. Was he drugging people? How he did it. So there's the question of, did he have associates? But when did Ivan Malat start killing people? Because Task Force Air never looked at that. It's quite a strange thing, isn't it? Like,
oh, look, I think they were satisfied that they'd got their man. I know there was a lot of families of other missing people who were upset that they didn't look deeper into whether he was responsible for their loved ones. But I guess you could...
Karen Rowlands is one.
Yeah, exactly.
Because that MO is like, it's got Ivan Malat written all over it.
Yeah. And I fully understand the families, and they deserve that justice. But it's a huge expense and a huge use of resources, to be doing it. And I think they got him. And I think Clive Small and the attitude was that, no, we've got him. He's not going to do any more. So whether, he gets charged for anything, he's never going to see the light of day. So they sort of, they left it at that. But I just wanted to add one thing where you said about
But do you accept that? Do you accept that that's fair enough to say, okay, we've pinged this guy for 7 murders. We're going to let him off for the 273 other ones he's done?
No, I don't accept it, but I understand the decision making by the police.
What if that there was another reason that they may not want to look at Ivan Milat's crimes, and that is because of his associations, the people he knew, and the people knew he was doing these things?
Look,
do you think that's a possibility?
Look, I think the stuff I've seen, I think anything's a possibility. And what you say now, I mean, the perfect example is Adelaide and the family murders. I mean, there's only one guy, Bevan von Einem, who's gone to jail for that. Yet there's been rumours for years that there were senior judicial officers, politicians, doctors, pillars of society that were involved in this family that would abduct young men and sexually abuse them and torture them over days and weeks before killing them.
What's interesting about that too is that point you make about people being abducted, because the suggestion with the Milat abductions. We don't know exactly where he abducted those people from, but the last places they were seen were Darlinghurst. So were King's Cross. So they weren't on Onions was picked up at a outside of like a takeaway store down at Liverpool, but no one else was seen. The last place they were physically seen was Darlinghurst.
I know the 2 British girls was, but I thought the others were. Last place they were seen, but I think that whether they've surmised it or guessed it, but I think that they were picked up on that road from Liverpool, heading towards Melbourne and stuff.
Yeah, the Hume Highway. That's what they've been surmised. But the last place they seen was Darlinghurst, and all those letters that got sent from people that were abducted. Kay Doherty. There was a couple from the northern suburbs. Those letters got sent out of Darlinghurst as well. And there's another murder back in 1966 of Anna Dowling or Anna Dowling Coa. Last place she was seen, a sex worker, was Darlinghurst, the Groves, and she was found butchered in a very similar way to the Belangolo murders on the down at Meni on the old Illawarra Road. And with that murder, that was almost exactly the same MO as Belangolo. In actual fact, one of the disturbing things with Belangolo, with Anna Dowling, and also with the Wanda Beach and Wilhelmina Kruger murders, was that there was a sexual assault post-mortem, necrophilia. And it just seems strange to me that police have never gone, how many people are there out there that do these savage murders with knives, sexually assault people after they're dead, and then leave them in places where everyone's going to find them? I just find it strange that you wouldn't go back and in a comprehensive way have a look at how many of these murders and disappearances like that. And then the other one, the other thing that I think comes up with the disappearances of those girls and the letters is the suggestion that they were kept because they're abducted, and there's a suggestion with Milat he was abducting people and that they had died straight away, that he'd abducted them and within hours but there's a possibility he may have had them for days. We don't know, do we?
No, we don't know. And I mean, one thing that I've thought of and discussed, because you mentioned earlier, about Milat, was there someone else involved in that? Look, from talking to not only Paul Gordon but other police that were involved in the investigation, Milat was very capable of carrying it out by himself. And I guess if you're holding a gun, if I'm holding a gun, I can control 10 people, let alone 2. So that sort of changes things. Now, do I think that there were others involved. I think for the majority of times when he picked these people up, I think he was alone. If he was with someone, my theory is it is with a woman, because I think that people would be reluctant to get into a vehicle with two rough-looking guys. But if there's a middle-aged woman in there or whatever with him, people think, oh, well, the little old lady, look, this is safe.
There was a suggestion his sister may have been involved.
Shirley, yeah.
Yeah, Shirley. And I know in with the Wests, you know, Rose and what was his name, West?
Yeah.
With the West, that's something that they did. They would go out, pick up hitchhikers, man and a woman. Oh, well, she's a woman.
Yeah.
She can't be a psycho killer.
Yeah.
Hold on. You know, you're in trouble.
Yeah. And look, that's the thing. And as for others, I think there's it's very, very possible what you said, that they weren't killed initially. And I think for me, the evidence that I look at which points to that is that they were incapacitated. A number of them had their spinal cord severed, right?
Yeah.
So you can still be alive.
Did
but
you know that's
can't move.
the same at Wanda Beach and Belangolo?
Oh.
Stabbed in the spine. It's exact same.
Yeah, I didn't know that. Yeah.
I think I sent you the identikit of Malat, of the Wanda Beach killer 1965 and Ivan Malat, his mugshot from 1964. Like I'm going to bring that up on the podcast now.
Yeah.
If that's not Ivan Malat,
Yeah.
I'm not here.
You know what? Anything's possible. There's no way that he started killing back in, the late 1980s.
Yeah.
I mean, well, we know he was offending and raping and picking up hitchhikers back in 72. So we know he's there. So, I mean, to go back, I don't know how old he would have been in the 60s or whatever, but yeah.
20.
20. Well, yeah. So look, anything's possible, and you don't start doing something like this when you're in your 30s or 40s. It's something that you grow into adulthood, and the more you get away with it, the more emboldened you become. Like you were talking about, he just left them in places where they could be found. I mean, that shows a confidence. That shows a confidence
where they wanted. Yeah, he wanted them to be found.
I'm never going to get caught. That sort of stuff. And we know he was like that. He was supremely confident and narcissistic. Why then would you keep the property of the people you murdered? I mean, it was a treasure trove, his house.
Well, maybe he was protected. Like I've asked questions at Parliament of how many times Ivan Milat was charged with offences, and so I'm trying to get that out of the government. What we've discovered is that Ivan Milat didn't have a driver's licence from 1971. Never had a driver's licence. He worked for the DMR and the RTA. You know, he worked on the King's Cross tunnel, tunnelling in Darlinghurst for 4 years. So he was working in Darlinghurst. He apparently told Noel Manning in jail that King's Cross was a playground for abducting people, but he never had a driver's licence from 1971. Worked for the DMR and the RTA. How do you get a traffic offence? How do you drive all over the state, working in Wollongong, Newcastle,
and not get busted?
Never get done for speeding.
But
pulled over.
I would have thought that when he worked for the roadworks that he would have had to show his license.
Exactly. Well, we found we've got a document. I'll bring it up on the screen now that shows his former wife wrote to the RTA and said Ivan doesn't have a license in 1986. And said and nothing happened. And we've actually asked Corrective Services when he was in jail. And we had a meeting with the New South Wales Department of Corrective Services, and they didn't know that he was in jail in Emu Plains in 1964, 65. We had to tell them that. They had no record, and they have no record of him being in Long Bay on remand in 1974 because he disappears for the rape and abduction while he's on bail. He gets bail for the rape and abduction, even though there's a high-speed car chase. While he's on bail, he commits 2 armed robberies with his brother and another man. Those 2 guys go to jail for 15 years each. Milat skips bail on that, and gets off on both the abduction and the armed robberies. And another interesting thing about Ivan Milat is he signed all his letters with a picture of the saint, the stick figure, the saint. Do you know why he did that? Well, this is my, back of the beer coaster theory, Manny, while I've got him. There was a TV series in the 1960s called The Saint.
Yeah, with Roger Moore.
And it was about a guy who was a vigilante working with the police to clean up the streets. When the police needed someone and the sort of to get out there and do the business. And I wonder, whether or not Ivan Milat's criminal career actually involved organised crime and working with some of these characters in the 60s and 70s, like your Abe Saffrons. We've had people on this podcast talking about his links to saffron and abducting people and feeding them into Costellos.
I wonder from what you're saying, if he was ever, it'd be interesting to find out if he was ever an informant for the police.
That is what I wonder too.
Yeah.
I wonder if he was ever a police informant and ever done that. He goes to jail in 1967. There's a period where he's not in jail when there's the Wanda Beach murders and the Wilhelmina Kruger and Anna Dowling murder. He's out
Kruger,
of
the woman in Wollongong?
Piccadilly.
Stanford, she was a cleaner.
Yeah, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
The suggestion she might have been involved in she had associations with men. I'd put it like that.
Yeah.
Anna Dowling was definitely a sex worker. With Schmidt, the Wanda Beach woman, and also one of the Wanda Beach girls, and Kruger, the police at the time said they thought that those people knew each other, and that the girl at the beach had been targeted. That the killer probably knew them.
Wow.
But Milat's out of jail for those murders. 71, you've got the Karen Rowlands, disappearance, and a couple of others. Milat gets out of jail in 1970. 6 months after he's out of jail, he goes and buys an XY Falcon Gold V8. It shows he was either like a busy boy working pretty hard. Like in today's money, that's a $60,000 car.
Yeah.
He goes out and buys the Falcon that he then drives around. It shows him he earned a bit of coin in those couple of months. I wonder what he was up to.
Yeah, or someone was giving him money. I mean, it's interesting. You mentioned Karen Rowland. I mean, there was her cousin's husband, who's a British policeman, that I believe you're going to catch up with soon, Hugh Hughes.
Yeah, very serious cop too, wasn't he?
Mate, 30 years.
30 years, yeah.
Very smart man. Hughes, in his investigation into his wife's cousin's murder, he's uncovered reports from females who lived in Canberra of a man being accosted by a man in the gold Fairlane.
Yeah. Exactly. I didn't know that. Exactly. And there's about half a dozen down and around ACT, Cooma, even down to Albury. There's even a couple of other southern end of Belangolo murders that haven't been attributed to Milat. And do you know the Michelle Pope, Stephen Lapthorne story about the
I know the names, yeah.
Yeah, well, disappeared out of North Sydney, lime green Bedford van, customised seats, disappeared.
Never found the car.
No, they found the car.
They did find the car.
They found the car. You know where they found it? Belangolo. They found it in Belangolo in 2018, and then it got burnt out. But there's photos of it on news.com. Belangolo. I mean, we got some letters out of corrective services from Milat writing to, at the time, the Attorney General, Bob Debus and others, complaining about how the identikit, people are stitching me up, he was writing, the identikit for the women that disappeared, Deborah Balkan and Jamison, that disappeared from the Tollgate Hotel in Parramatta, that the identikit looked like him, but it's not fair, he was complaining. I didn't have the mustache at that time, which is another thing he said in the Belangolo case. When you look at it, you just think there's a lot of smoke coming up from this. A really fascinating one is in 1994 when they were doing the Wood Royal Commission, and this is what piqued my interest. I'd raised this issue of the murdered and missing women on the north coast. I had a woman write to me and said, look, someone she knew, a sort of family member, I'll put it like that, knew Ivan, had done bad things with Ivan. And so I started to have a look. Okay, well, has there ever been any suggestion in the Parliament? You can do what's called a Hansard search, whether or not that Ivan had any other sort of dealings or associates. And in 1994, the police minister, when he was arguing against the Wood Royal Commission, Terry Griffith, got up in Parliament and he said to the Labor Party, to Bob Carr, trying to stop the Wood Royal Commission, he said, do you want an investigation into all the Labor Party scandals in this state? Do you want an investigation into the Wanda Beach and Belangolo murders? Now, he linked them.
Wow.
And why did he say they were a political scandal? And he said that before Ivan Milat was known to the public. Ivan Milat was going to be arrested 11 days later. He said it on the 10th of May, 1994.
Wow.
Milat was arrested on the 21st.
Jesus.
So why does the police minister get up and say it's a political scandal? And why does he say they're linked to Wanda Beach and Belangolo? And then you look at the MOs and you go, it's the same thing. Stabbed, sexually assaulted after death, and left in public places. You know, there's a lot of questions there. A lot of questions.
But look, I think that's what it is with someone like Milat. I mean, you can link him to a lot of things, and he may very well be responsible. But the thing is, you know, you need sort of direct evidence to link him. I guess the only thing, I mean, if we wanted to get to the bottom of it, I mean, the only thing I can think of, the most obvious for me is I imagine the Wanda Beach murders, a lot of these unsolved murders, you know, where there was a body, there's physical evidence left behind, whether it's semen or blood or something. So there's DNA there. And get a DNA, and I'm sure they've got Milat's DNA somewhere, and compare it.
Yeah, well, they lost the DNA for the Wanda Beach murders.
Oh,
yeah, they actually had a partial sample, and then they didn't. Yeah, it's a wild one, the Wanda Beach murders, and I think it really starts a period where we're discovering we just last week we discovered that there was a fella killed in inner Sydney in 1966 who was apparently, you know, a very violent stabbing in inner Sydney. Another one down in Marrickville, that period in 1966 when Ivan's out of jail. There's some pretty savage stabbing murders, and the organised crime really sorts itself out. You know, Freeman, McPherson, Saffron take control of the prostitution, the SP bookies, and some of these other characters who wannabes are bumped. And who did that? Who did that business? And I wonder. There's a lot of questions there, and we keep asking them. You keep asking them that through your podcast, that Murdered Missing, like you, just through your podcast, by asking these questions, you've had really important information come forward, haven't you?
Well, we have. I mean, as I mentioned earlier, you know, we've indirectly, you know, a sexual predator has been charged with, you know, raping a young girl back in 1980 when she was 16 years old.
Yeah,
and he's pled guilty to it. You know, we've also as a result of the story, Darwin Northern Territory Police exhumed the body of a murdered baby boy.
Then that isn't just an absolutely crazy story, wasn't it? There was a dead baby posted from Adelaide to Melbourne
to Darwin. Yeah, not back in 1965. So, you know, 60 years ago. You know, Victorian Police, Northern Territory Police, you know, both investigating it. You know, the trial went cold very quick. The sender's details turned out to be fake, didn't exist in the address, but it was sent to the Darwin Post Office, addressed to Jay Anderson. They couldn't find who Jay Anderson was. I interviewed Denver Marchant, who was the first officer on the scene, and a man who spent 40 years in law enforcement, a really good cop. In his 80s now, went up to Harvey Bay and interviewed him, and he shared with me for the first time that he'd never told anyone before that he always had a belief that Jay Anderson may have been a famous Indigenous footy player called Jimmy Anderson. So I rang with that, and I was contacted by Jimmy Anderson's daughters, and they said that their dad had been dead for 7 years, but that he was a bit of a player back in the day, and that that he very well could have been the father of this child. I guess one theory was that impregnated someone, abandoned them, they've sent the kid to him, or a woman that was married and the husband murdered the child and sent it to the lover. So the police in Northern Territory about 2 years ago applied to the deputy coroner to exhume the baby's body. The coroner said no, because you need a pretty good reason. So after I did the podcast and Anderson's daughters contacted me, I contacted the Northern Territory Police, who were in charge, put them in contact with the daughters. They went in, gave a statement, took DNA, and then police, with that and new information, applied to the deputy coroner. And in November last year, they exhumed the baby's body. So they now have an excellent sample of DNA from the deceased child. So it's 60 years. I mean, the people responsible, the person who murdered the child, is probably no longer alive. But I think it's important to find out who they were and to give this poor child a name, so that its gravestone can at least have a name or something on there.
Very important,
Yeah.
and it sends a really strong message to the community that the community won't tolerate these types of crimes. That we will keep looking, keep asking the questions. That justice never sleeps.
Yeah, but it's also the community. I mean, I think for me the big thing is the catch cry for the podcast is someone somewhere knows something, and I believe that. There's always with these missing persons cases, with unsolved murders, there's always someone. They may not have directly seen someone do it, but that person's behaviour may have elicited something.
Because down the track, at the time, someone might not say something because there's a familial relationship. I don't want to say something about uncle. Since I've been speaking out, I've had a lot of people say, look, I didn't speak out at the time, but Uncle X, I didn't say something because it was my uncle, but he had these behaviours. You should have a look at him.
Relationships,
they break
up. People die.
Yeah. Even Malat's wife, took the stand against him.
So I think the thing is, it's really important. I mean,
ex-wife.
Police don't have a crystal ball. I wish I had a crystal ball. I really wish I did, so I could solve all these cases. I don't. Police don't. Police rely in any case. Most of the time they rely on the public, information from the public. So I think that's what's really important. I think if people do know anything, regardless of whether they think it's important or not important, don't you make the decision. Contact police and let them be the judge of whether it's something or not. Because there really are. There's just too many cases there. There's no resolution, murders and missing people, and what
are the numbers like? It's like you were talking about before.
I think just in New South Wales, there's more than 700 unsolved murders. Around Australia, there's over 2,600 long-term missing people. So that's someone been missing more than 3 months. And there's also 700 unidentified bodies and remains that are in unnamed graves and in morgues, and no one knows who they are. I mean, I find that just I think it's such a horrible indictment on society. I mean, how can someone die and no one misses them, and no one comes forward to say who they are? Like, I've covered it on a couple of such cases, the baby, because it's unidentified. And there's also one that I've covered on the podcast and it's in the book, although I call the Pakenham man, a gentleman of Indian or Pakistani background who, took his own life by laying, between the carriages of a train down in Pakenham outside of Melbourne. Now, that happened more than 10 years ago, right? They have colour video of the gentleman in the carriage and on the platform. So the photos of him are normal, really clear photos. Gone through the media, I've done it. I put it through. There was like an Indian Welfare Society with 50,000 members in Melbourne, Victoria. We put all the images and that through that. He's still unidentified. it's just, like 700 people. It's not like one. And the big thing is with, as I said, the missing people and these unsolved murders. But that means that there's someone walking around among us who's a killer.
Yeah.
I mean, that's
Well, that's what people said to me. They said, "Oh, Jeremy, you've said on the North Coast there might be a serial killer," and I said because there's, what we clearly 60, maybe 80 unsolved homicides. Sure there'd be a drug overdose and misadventure and that, but we know in like 40 of them it's likely to have been murder. And I'm saying, well, okay, some of them might be linked, so that's a serial killer, and if they're not, that means that there's 20 murderers out there who are down the shops, feed up, cold beer, fishing, going, I got away with it. Yeah. And it's just not good enough.
Yeah, and that's why I think we've got to be careful. There's, as I said, the points you made with those similarities between Malat and the Wanda Beach and other cases, they're very pertinent points. But I think we just got to accept the fact that Malat wasn't responsible for all of them. Like, Paul Gordon says he believes he's killed more than 60 people. Neville Scullion, another detective who investigated the 2 English backpackers when they went missing, because they went missing, like you said, from King's Cross. Yeah. The backpackers was right next to where King's Cross detectives were housed. He says more than 80. So he's definitely responsible for more than the 7 backpackers. But as I said, the sad reality is that there are other people out there who have gotten away with murder. And, these guys need to be brought to justice. And the only way that can happen is if someone that knows something picks up the phone and calls police.
One of the interesting things that's emerging in this space, and I was talking to Xanthi Mallet about, Dr. Xanthi Mallet about this, is AI. Because one of the troubles we've got back and stuff was analog, and you were working, it's all paper, and you've got to get the records from here and the records from there, and you've physically got to have them in your hand. Now it's digital. You can find some of them, but some are still on paper records. But there's just vast amounts of all the crimes and all the information. One of the things that AI may help us with and is going, hold on, making the links between a particular person, a particular time, a particular location and crimes, and say, well, hold on, this can help narrow down the field. Because terribly, when you start looking into these things, like when I was in Bellingen, I was going, well, how many, we've got 3 murders in this one town, how many potential suspects are there? And all of a sudden you're talking to a retired police and they say, well, there's 25, convicted sex predators in the area, and you think, oh, that's alarming, but you can skinny it down. Technology can help us.
Well, yeah, I mean, look, it's so important to link things that are similar. Otherwise, you're chasing your tail, And in regards to missing people, I'm really happy to say that about 3 years ago, a detective called New South Wales Police called Glenn Brown took over the missing persons unit, and it was like, there was a lot of things that could have been done better. And Glenn had what the changes he made is at the forefront now of missing persons investigations in Australia, and I think all the other states should copy it. But the most important thing he did was he put together a folder of standard operating procedures. So it sets out what every cop on the street should be doing when they take a missing persons report, what the detective should be doing, even up to the commander of the police station, what things they should be checking and following up. And what it does, it provides a guide now, so everyone's on the same page, And I think the old days, back in the past when I was in, if someone came and reported a teenager, especially a teenage girl missing, she's just run away. That was just the way it was dealt with. I'll come back in 48 hours, right? Thankfully, it doesn't happen like that anymore. It's much more immediate. You don't have to wait 24 hours, If you're concerned about someone, go straight to the police. But as I said, the blueprint that Glenn Brown has created for New South Wales Police in terms of how you look into missing persons cases is really brilliant.
Well, look, Manny, the blueprint you've created for being a good cop, a good journalist, and a good human being is really brilliant. I really appreciate the work that you've done in this particular area. It's very important, fighting the good fight for justice, making sure that those families out there who have, murdered and missing loved ones know that there's people using the media, using their skills, using their resources, fighting away. So it's inspirational. I really appreciate the work you do, and so many people do. Remember, everyone, check out Manny's new book, which is Someone Somewhere Knows Something. Someone Somewhere Knows Something, coming out early July. And also check out Manny's podcast, the Missing Australia. Absolutely fantastic. Thanks very much, mate, for coming into the weeds and sharing your story and your incredible journey. Thanks, mate.
Thanks, mate. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.